another week. If you haven't had a chance to finish the lit study for last week's to-do lists, please stop this video and go check those out. What I'd like you to do is make sure that you get caught up before you do this week's to-do list. I still had a lot of you that didn't get a chance to complete that larger-than-life Laura Microsoft form that was uploaded to Clever. So please go ahead and do those things first, and I'll see you back here in just a little bit when you're done, okay? Thank you. For everybody else that is caught up and ready to go, we are starting this week with Chapter 8. We left off in Chapter 7, learning about all the different things that are going on in the story. We learned about our main characters. So we're going to start this week with Chapter 8, and that's called Minor Characters. Now, I'm going to be pausing along the way, and you're going to see questions pop up on the screen as I'm talking. I want you to please consider those questions, because if we talk about it, I would like you to be able to be a part of the conversation. Here we go, Chapter 8, Minor Characters. Joey Gilbert is the kind of kid who would never settle for being a minor character in a story, so I will leave him out of this chapter as much as possible, but the truth is that Joey was never very far out of the picture. His opposition just kept growing and growing, sometimes at recess, where I could swear he started keeping his arm straighter when he pitched, and his pitches started hitting the strike zone every single time. Sometimes in class where he whispered his meanness instead of putting it into a note and signing it. But mostly, he was the biggest opposition at lunch times. But he's no minor character, so I'm done talking about him in this chapter. Maddie Simpson is the kind of person you'd like to look like if you were to have the secret idea that you wanted to be an actress when you got out of school. She's not too fat or too skinny. Her blonde hair is long and wavy and never looks like she's to the day when it ought to get washed. It doesn't hurt that she wears clothes like the middle school and even high school girls wear. You hardly ever see her in the same clothes that she's worn before. 2 days before tryouts for Fair Day were scheduled to happen, Maddie and her best friend Sarah surprised the socks out of all of us at our first hour lunch period. I better say here that Sarah is the kind of person who doesn't know if she wants a hot dog or a hamburger, or a Pepsi or a Coke, until the other person has ordered first. They got their trays of cafeteria lunch like they always did, both of them picking the exact same thing, but instead of going to the head table with the other popular fourth graders, they stood in the middle of the cafeteria and looked all around. Then they weaved through the tables of noisy lunch eaters until they got to Laura's table. Laura had her own chair in the cafeteria. She'd gotten it after the cafeteria opposition thing that happened with Joey Gilbert, but I'm not getting into that here because he's not a minor character. The janitor set up Laura's lunch chair special right before first lunch period and then took it away right after. He saw to it that the chair was pushed up to one of the long cafeteria tables instead of being off by itself, but it ended up off by itself anyway because nobody, and I mean nobody, ever sat down with larger-than-life Laura. I hate lunch. Usually I sit with Teresa and Amanda, even if they're being best friends and only talking to each other that day. Sometimes a reject boy or two will sit at the same table as us, only they act like it's a different table and maybe even a different cafeteria or a different school altogether. Our table was 2 tables away from the empty table that Laura's chair was at. Sometimes I'd sneak a peek at her and she'd look like she was the only one enjoying lunch. Not because she gobbled her lunch or ate more than other kids. She just looked like she enjoyed it because of that smile of hers. So back to Maddie. She walked right up to Laura. Sarah followed her, staying behind like she was afraid of what Laura might do. "Are these seats taken?" Maddie asked. Laura had to know Maddie was up to something because those seats were never taken. "No, they're not. Please be seated, Maddie and Sarah," Laura answered. Somehow, after a couple days at our school and with nobody talking to her, Laura seemed to know every single person's name. "Thank you," Maddie said fake sweetly. Sarah still looked scared, but she sat down when Maddie did. Somebody dropped a tray on the other side of the cafeteria. Silverware clattered on the floor. Somebody busted out laughing. There were kids yelling at each other at the popular tables where Maddie and Sarah ought to have been eating. There was one table between where I was sitting and their table, but I could hear. Our end of the cafeteria was a lot quieter for one thing, and for another, not only was Laura's table empty, but the next table to her was also empty at that end, like people were afraid fatness was something that you could catch if you ate too close to it. "So, how do you like school?" Maddie asked, like they were old friends and she was really interested in something that wasn't about her. I love school, Laura said. Where else can you learn every day and meet all kinds of new people? What's not to love? When Laura said that, you had to believe her. It was something in her eyes, and the way the smile didn't go away. Mrs. Smith taught us that sarcastic is how you are being when you say the opposite from what you really mean. Like when I say to my middle big brother, Matt, "Oh, that's real cute, Matt." Only it isn't. Saying Matt's cute when he isn't is sarcastic. This is not the same thing as lying. When you lie, you don't want the other person to know it's a lie. If you're sarcastic, you do want the other person to know that you're saying the opposite of what you mean, and you're saying it kind of snotty. Well, Laura wasn't being sarcastic. In spite of Joey Gilbert's pig note, and in spite of what he did to her later that day in the cafeteria, and in spite of what kids said to her and about her, Laura Phelps liked school. Laura turned to Sarah. "So, Sarah, are you going to try out for a part in the play Fair Day?" Sarah glanced at Maddie. I guess. Maddie swung on her. "You didn't tell me you were trying out. I'm supposed to be your best friend, and you didn't say anything to me about it. What part? What part are you trying out for?" "I think you'd make a great Adeline," Laura said. She took really little bites of food, so it was taking her a long time to finish her hot lunch. "Do you really think I'd be a great Adeline? Really?" Sarah was asking with her eyes getting big. "I do," Laura answered. "I heard you sing in music yesterday." "You heard me?" Sarah asked. "But you were in the back." Sarah and Maddie always sit front row center in the music class. Miss Brandywine loves them so much she doesn't even yell at them when they giggle and talk all during music. Laura nodded. "I still heard you. You're good." "Wait a minute." Maddie raised her voice, even though she wouldn't have had to. "I'm trying out for Adeline. I told you that." I know, Sarah said quickly, "and everybody knows you'll get it." "So?" Maddie had control back. "So you can be Adeline's friend. You know, the one that helps her fix her hair when she's going to meet Tom? You know." Sarah shrugged and nodded at the same time. And then it seemed to be all settled when a funny thing happened next. Laura looked up from her tray and stared right at Sarah, like Maddie wasn't even sitting between them. She didn't stand up like she did for Joey in our class, but here's what she said. "Sarah Rivers, with a silvery voice, reach for the stars, it's still your choice. You can do it, though it's scary. Fear is so unnecessary." When Laura was done with her rhyming poem, Sarah's pink lipsticked mouth hung open like a snagged fish. Maddie looked from Laura to Sarah like they were in a ping-pong match. "I don't get it." All the sweet had gone right out of her voice. "What's wrong with you? Normal people don't just go around rhyming things in the middle of a cafeteria. We only came over here because we felt sorry for you. I was going to try to help you by telling you that you should stop eating desserts, for crying out loud. Then maybe you'd start looking like a human instead of a fat pig." Sarah didn't say anything. Maddie did. "But since you're the smart one with all the advice, here." She took her own brownie from her tray and banged it down on Laura's tray. Then she grabbed Sarah's too and shoved it at Laura. "Go ahead." She stood up and clutched her tray. "Pig out, pig." Sarah just sat there staring at her brownie on Laura's tray. "Sarah!" Maddie shouted from halfway across the cafeteria. Kids stopped horsing around to stare. Sarah hurried from the table and ran to join Maddie. There were lots of other minor characters who did things to Laura, and here is one. Eric Rodabaugh is the kind of kid who would have been a shark if he'd been an animal. We learned in science that sharks have to keep moving around all the time or they'll die dead. And that's Eric. He can't sit still. Eric went to the pencil sharpener about 100 times a day, and every time he did, he'd take a left up an aisle, dart another left, squeeze himself between desks, and end up right next to Laura's desk. Then he'd poke her with the pencil, or bump into her, or elbow her. Once, on the way back to his seat, he pretended like he had bumped into Laura and bounced off and landed on the floor. Everybody laughed. Which reminds me of Wayne. Wayne Wilson, who, if you can remember back as far as Chapter 2, you won't be surprised about, was the loudest kid in our class. In fact, he was the loudest kid in the whole 4th grade and maybe all of Paris Elementary. And it wouldn't surprise me none if he was the loudest kid in the whole state of Missouri. Wayne is the kind of kid who's the first to laugh and the last to understand why everybody's laughing. During that first week of Larger-than-Life Laura, Wayne laughed first when the wind caught Laura's skirt after school on Tuesday, and it blew up so as you could see the back of her thigh, which was bigger than a horse's patootie. Wayne laughed the loudest when our teacher had us help her make a list of cliches on the board, and Laura gave her more than the rest of us put together, and they all had to do with being fat. Fat as a pig, big as a house, big as a barn, the fat of the land, it ain't over till the fat lady sings. Wayne laughed hard at each and every one of those. But Mrs. Smith, she said that Laura got them all right, and that those sayings were really just expressions people use so much that they lose their meaning. Only, I wondered about that, about those words losing their meaning. And last, Wayne was the first to laugh when Mrs. Smith said, "Who's planning on trying out for a part in our play?" And Laura raised her hand, her very big arm, and the fat on the bottom part of her arm jiggled. Finally, in this chapter on minor characters, I got to add this. Lainey Grafton is the kind of person that doesn't do open meanness to another person, but couldn't help be a little bit glad that meanness was going to someone else for a change. Because for 3 whole days, nobody called her a name or tripped her at recess.